Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to be here tonight with you and with an amazing panel of guests to discuss the topic of Palestine, health, and the limits of humanitarianism. First, some very exhilarating technical pointers. Please stay on mute during the call. You can have your camera on or off, whatever you prefer, and please feel free to take breaks as you like. Put your questions in the chat. Nina will be monitoring the chat, so please put your questions in and also any concerns or issues that you might be having. I'll be monitoring the questions and kind of weaving them into the discussion as we go. Auto captioning is available. Hopefully, it should be on the bottom right of your screen if you need to enable it. So I'm going to start with a bit of an opening, and then I will hand over to wonderful speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll kind of jump right into the discussion. But first, I'm sure I don't need to lay out to you all why we're here tonight. The genocide in Gaza has displayed with the utmost brute and vigor the violence of a settler-colonial state propped up, of course, by its Western colonial capitalist sponsors. From the sudden violence of drone strikes on hospitals and tents set ablaze, to the slower violence of environmental destruction, damage to health systems, and the poisoning of the land, the Zionist entity and those who support it are incompatible with health and life. In the face of this, Palestinians and Palestinian health workers have waged a relentless struggle for sovereignty over their bodies, their land, and their health system. As Israel targets the bodies and minds of Palestinians in ever more violent ways, from constant surveillance to deliberate disablement, health and healthcare is revealed to everyone for what it is, a site of multifaceted struggle for life and dignity. The contours of that struggle are many, but certainly structural, clinical, economic, and political, and we'll be touching on some of these tonight. And what we mean by this is Palestinian health workers have shown us that the struggle to provide medical care to people who are being annihilated, fighting for life and survival in the face of an entity which wants death. In this way, the act of providing clinical care itself, where it is denied, becomes the deepest act of resistance. As well as this, the struggle for health we know is structural, as many have done for a long time. That health is impossible without the conditions that reproduce life. In the case of Gaza, we see how children can't heal from operations because they are being starved. We see how infectious diseases spread rampantly through displaced populations. It shows us that the health of the land is one and the same as the health of the people, not only the healthcare that is present. Companies like Palantir, who develop and profit their AI off killer warfare and surveillance technologies used in Palestine and the US, are themselves struggling for a slice of the UK health system, gleaning the profits that come from biting off the pieces of a health system crushed by austerity, and for the valuable data that comes from our health interactions. They show us that an economy based off profit, surveillance, war, and borders that props up capitalism is inextricably linked across struggles, in this case linking our datasets in the UK to the AI targeting systems used in Gaza. They show us that healthcare is a key site of profit and wealth extraction and of policing and surveillance, often prioritizing that over care. The struggle for health is also a struggle for narration and political power, and we have seen how health workers and the lens of health justice can be a deeply powerful and destabilizing force. Unprecedented health worker political mobilization in the UK has been met itself with an unprecedented crackdown on our freedom of expression, alongside wider political crackdowns on direct action, funneling us towards marches and endless fitness to practice tribunals rather than focusing on economic and political power. These contours of struggle are not unique to Gaza, but a feature of a colonial capitalist system which does not value life, but values only the endless accumulation of wealth and power, as it becomes increasingly violent and increasingly fascist. In the UK, the government has been taking clinical care away from trans people, reducing essential support for disabled people, expanding police powers, and escalating violent deportations of those our elites deem scapegoatable, whilst corporations grow richer. For many, Gaza has shown in an unprecedented light our economic and political system for the soulless and violent machine that it is. There are many who perhaps had not thought this before and wondered how this could happen, why our representatives were ignoring us, and when they would see sense. But what we know is that the existing systems of governance, accountability, and advocacy, whatever checks and balances they may claim to hold, have been shown to be at best incompetent, but usually willfully complicit. Most of us in this room now know that corporations, politicians, big tech, and the like do not respond to our beliefs or moral outrage, but to profit and power. So tonight, we'll start by problematizing some of the frameworks that have completely failed us and failed to respond to the scale of genocidal violence that we're witnessing in Gaza. We want the audience to explore with us how the frameworks we are given as health workers, from the demand for us to be neutral and purely neutral evidence-based, to humanitarianism as the only option for response to crisis, are designed to hold us back from meaningful political action. As a counter to this, we'll then move on to discussing historical and current politicized clinical work, community healthcare, and health worker organizing. This is especially important for the work of MedAct as the new strategy marks a shift from using the health worker voice to support communities impacted by health inequalities to organizing alongside them and building our own ability to enact solidarity in the many forms that may take, not passively declaring solidarity. We need to be organized and powerful enough not only to say that we don't want this, but we have the power to stop it. As Andreas Malm writes in this very excellent book, The Destruction of Palestine is the Destruction of the Earth, we are dealing here with an exceedingly deep structure, not an event or two, a ratcheting up and escalation across 2 centuries, a worsening and intensification of patterns first developed in the 19th century, also, not coincidentally, the temporal form of global warming itself. So this is a big task for us to discuss and problematize and dream and move towards. So bear with us, submit questions as we go. I'll be compiling them into prompts. This event will be recorded and shared afterwards, so don't worry about taking notes unless you really want to. And yeah, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists to please introduce themselves. I don't know if you want to start.
I'm Hannah Calla. I'm a paediatrician in London.
I'm Layth Hanbali. I'm a community health researcher from Palestine.
I'm Ghassan Abu Sitta. I'm a plastic and reconstructive surgeon.
I'm James Smith. I'm an emergency doctor and lecturer in humanitarian studies here in London.
Thank you so much. And yeah, just a shout out to the very wonderful Amira, who was also meant to be on the panel from Health Workers for Palestine, who unfortunately can't join us due to illness. I'm going to share a couple of things that she was really excited to share with the audience tonight. But yeah, big love to Amira, and we miss her very much. Layth, could I ask you to kick us off? And speak to how some of the concepts, but not only concepts, also kind of financial, physical, and political structures that make up some of these things that get thrown in, global health, humanitarianism, even kind of decolonizing global health, how they have acted to uphold capitalist and colonial structures of violence, especially in the Palestinian context.
Yeah, thank you, Rhiannon, and to MedAct for hosting this space. So when I think, let's take decolonizing global health because it's maybe the most radical sounding one out of the 3, but I'll touch on all of them. I think that to understand how actually it can become a structure that upholds injustice and oppression, I like to follow through what the logic of this concept would do if we followed it right to the end, right? So let's say that this idea of decolonizing global health gets all that it wants. Everyone who's working on decolonizing global health is able to get all of the funding that they are applying for. These university departments that are preaching this and these NGOs that are talking about it get everything that they possibly can in order to achieve their aims. Will that lead to oppressed people, colonized people getting their land back? And the answer, in my opinion, is no. And I'll try to expand, and then we'll be in conversation about this. So, I mean, we don't need to read Frantz Fanon. We just have to ask anyone who's colonized, how would your life improve, right? How could we rid you of the oppression that you're under? And, land is central. And especially when we talk about Palestine, it's not about decolonizing knowledge production. It's not about including more people in the conversation. It's not about Palestinian voices. It's about land. It's about resources. And obviously, we know from the discourse around neocolonialism that resource extractivism then extend even beyond the decolonization of countries, of the states, and can then be born into a new life by the imperial core, by Western countries. And so, it's about land, it's about resources. And so we've got to start, that has to be our starting point. But then, so then when we talk about, okay, following through decolonizing global health to the end, people talk about this kind of radical shift as a principle. But then as soon as you start asking for roadmaps, as soon as you start asking for, okay, so what action would this entail? You actually end up with a sanitization of the existing systems rather than any kind of overhaul of them. It's not about even redistributing resources. It's just about including, more voices in the conversation. It's about recognizing some of the causes of the injustice, but without fundamentally changing them. And, here, I just want to, because I know a lot of people attending will probably be coming from backgrounds, working in some of these universities, on some of these programs, and some of these NGOs. And it's just really important to just here, bear in mind that the vast majority of humanitarian, like when we talk about the hegemonic ideas and action within humanitarianism and global health, that's not the thing that like small organizations, small radical collectives and organizations are doing on the ground. The vast majority of that work is being funded by the very countries and military powers and foreign governments that conducted the genocide, that are conducting the genocide in Palestine, in Congo, in Sudan. And so obviously they're not going to be funding or abetting or giving any kind of power or exposure to whether it's academic institutions or non-governmental organizations or collectives or campaigns that are going to in any way risk the power that they have spent 200 years, as Andres Malm speaks to very well in the book. They're not going to fund any sort of radical change to that system. And so, you can speak about the injustice, but ultimately it doesn't give anyone the land back if you don't replace the power, these systems of power with something different.
Thank you. Hassan, would you mind coming in on kind of how these dynamics of humanitarianism have played out in your experiences and how that contrasts to the idea of kind of building a sovereign health system and working for liberation through practicing medicine?
So I think we start with the idea that since the ceasefire, a large number of humanitarian organizations have been offering millions, if not tens of millions, to the Palestinian Ministry of Health to buy the existing Palestinian hospitals, some of whom are just a pile of rubble. And so the question is, why would you want to buy something like Abu Yusuf Najjar Hospital in Rafah, which is literally now a pile of rubble? And the answer is to buy off the last vestiges of Palestinian sovereignty that have proven resistant to the genocidal politics of erasure. And with that, you step back during the last 2 years, and then you ask yourself a question. Those humanitarian organizations receiving funding from Germany or the United Kingdom or France, why would they be in Gaza while their governments and their countries that pay them are involved in the genocide, not in assisting or supporting, but actually are actively involved in the genocide? And you realize that the aim of this humanitarian intervention by these governments is one to humanitarianize the genocide, i.e. to posit the idea that you can both continue humanitarian work and continue the genocide simultaneously. And two, to act as mechanisms for increasing dependency and diminishing Palestinian sovereignty and taking advantage of the need that this genocide is creating, the basic need for food and clean water and medication, as a way of extorting Palestinian health sovereignty. And so the two go hand in hand. The violence of the genocide and its destruction of human life, and the creation of exigency to accept whatever is offered as a mechanism by which you can save some lives, and then to go around and offer this. And for me, I think this genocidal war heralds the end of humanitarianism, because as a tool, first of all, as a tool of Western power that has declared itself to be genocidal again in the 21st century against Palestinians, against people of color. Two, as a tool of liberal capitalism, which has signed its own deathbed by basically having its own genocide, having come to power after the Second World War as a negation to the genocide of the Second World War. And as we can see now, global capitalism is no longer interested in reaching an accommodation with liberalism, and now prefers pure violence, pure epistemic violence, linguistic violence, political and military violence, without the need for soft power in the form of US aid or in the form of any of these institutions that played a critical role in American imperialism throughout the last 100 years. And so we see that humanitarianism participated in the genocide and therefore morally has become bankrupt, and is no longer a useful tool for its masters, who within global capital, who now prefer pure violence rather than veiled violence of humanitarianism.
Yeah, thank you so much. And James, as someone who has alongside Hassan worked in Gaza and then done a lot of media engagement around the UK, and then kind of come back to the UK and navigated some of the tensions around that role, it would be really interesting to hear your reflections and challenges of navigating, as you know, a researcher and academic, a very critical understanding of humanitarianism, and then also in some ways being forced to engage with the structures that currently exist. So it'd be really great to hear kind of some of your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to fumble through an answer here because these are questions that I'm asking myself all the time, and I don't think I have a particularly coherent answer. Other than to say that I would describe myself, for all of the reasons that Layth and Hassan have just articulated, as anti-humanitarian, which I think has caused some confusion for my students who have all enrolled on an MSc program in humanitarian studies. But I hold absolutely everything that's just been shared to be true. So if we take that indeed to be true, and the intensity of the expression of the violence that is caught up within humanitarianism to have been brought into stark relief in Gaza, then how then do you grapple with the desire and the motivation to engage in some form of internationalist solidarity that can only be expressed, or at the very least access to Gaza, certainly as it is configured now, particularly after the invasion, destruction and occupation of the Rafah border crossing, is entirely controlled by the genocidal entity, by the Zionist entity. So access is predetermined, and people are being denied for, well, the reasons are never clear, but certainly both Hassan and I have been denied on multiple occasions, and many others as well. And of course, that's to say nothing of Palestinians who are unable to enter or exit Gaza. So there is the constraint that is imposed by the genocidal entity itself. That is perhaps the primary constraint in terms of actually just even being able to get into Gaza. But then there are the constraints imposed by the organizations themselves. And I think that they would often look to Israel and to excuse their own inaction. We have seen at times very strong rhetoric from figures within the UN system, surprisingly strong at times. And yet these organizations, these entities, these agencies, individually and collectively, have failed to act in a coherent and cohesive fashion. They have been instrumentalized by Israel as a core pillar of the occupation and of the genocide, and we're seeing that in being reconfigured now in the context of the so-called ceasefire. So you have the constraints imposed by the organizations that you work for. They don't want you to say certain things. They want you to wipe your social media profiles before you enter and while you're there. And then, of course, you're constrained by other industries that want to engage with you after the fact or perhaps during. So the media, as you mentioned, Rhiannon, and the narratives that the media want to present, the briefs that you're given, the sort of voyeurism that they want to present to a particular public is intense. You can, of course, navigate some of these spaces by reframing questions or responding in the way that you want to respond when it comes to the organizations you work for, disregarding the briefs or the silencing that they try and impose upon you. But the reality is that everything is controlled by Israel, by the humanitarian organizations themselves, by the media that's wanting to engage with you. And all of this is a process of humanitarianization at best. This is a thin veil for a particularly extreme form of violence.
Just to add, the mere idea that for 2 years, neither the perpetrator, Israel, nor its co-conspirators, the Western governments, have found any contradiction between humanitarianism and genocidal killing, highlights the fact that principally they're both exercises of imperial power, rather than humanitarianism as an opposing force or a form of resistance to imperial power.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I mean, I think you have this situation wherein humanitarianism has failed on either count. If you believe that you can have such a thing as a functional humanitarianism amid genocide, then it has failed in the sense that it has been unable to meet even the most basic needs of 2.1 million Palestinians. But indeed, if you believe kind of politically, ideologically, that there can be such a thing as functionality while genocide is ongoing, then what indeed is humanitarianism? I said this to Layth last week, that some of the industries that have profited and flourished the most during the course of the genocide are the arms industries and are the entities that are bringing in the food aid. They are among the industries that have profited most profoundly alongside those who are dropping the bombs.
And I think a lot of also what humanitarianism does is capture also an energy for international solidarity and funnel it into this highly kind of complicit infrastructure. And before coming to Hannah, I wanted to maybe go back to Layth or Hassan about how humanitarianism demands kind of Palestinians and other kind of recipients of humanitarianism to be apolitical agents. They aren't agents in their own liberation. They are recipients of humanitarian solidarity, but never an international solidarity based on mutual struggle.
Well, not just that, but not just apolitical agents, but perfect victims and only victims, right? The mere suggestion that a Palestinian recipient of aid, not that a recipient, a Palestinian narrator of any form of suffering might in any way be related to someone who might think about resisting these forces is unfathomable, right? The biggest scandal in British media over the last 2 years has not been on any of the frankly insane kind of deranged reporting that we've seen, which either brings Palestinians on just to bully them or demands them to condemn our own almost our existence and our very legitimate political demands, But what actually was sanctioned across in the entirety of British media is when a child narrating a documentary was related. I think it was related to a Palestinian political leader in some way, and they're a child, but they're in proximity to someone who's a Palestinian political figure. And there's no way that you can think of a Palestinian political figure as a potential recipient of a worthy recipient of resistance of assistance, let alone thinking about any of the other things that you might grant them, such as respect, for fighting for their liberation or anything else. So it's that, right? And this is the perfect victims argument has been made incredibly well by Muhammad al-Kurd in his book, Perfect Victims. Yeah, I think that really sums it up for me is that you've just got to be a perfect victim, and they're not, the humanitarian organizations are not willing to even step 1 centimeter away from that. They constantly just have to reframe the Palestinian experience as one only of suffering, not one of agency, and their own actions as this thing that is so innocent and so innocuous, that there can't possibly even be any. It can't even be complicated, right? It's not meant to be. And for me, that's incredibly damaging, because actually it works to demobilize people away from things that are needed. So the fact that it took as long as it did for flotillas to start sailing and for convoys to start driving to the border is the scandal. That is the scandal of humanitarianism, is that these organizations, knowing what they know, this is especially on the organizations that were in there and that have been in Gaza for as many years as they have. The second that actually the Zionist officials said, we are cutting off everything, should have been the rallying call to say, well, we're sailing, we're driving. Instead, it was a negotiation, and they continue to sit down and try to comply with all of the restrictions that the Israelis are imposing on them, even after publicly saying that they're not going to comply. So they're even lying to themselves and to everyone else, and then sitting down with the Israelis to ask how far back they should bend, instead of continuing to challenge. All of these, flotillas, the convoys, have been popular movements. They've not even been supported by these so-called humanitarian organizations that are continuing to work within the confines of what Israel is telling them. Not a single one has said, we're going to pull out and resist instead. Not a single one. Some of them have been kicked out. Not a single one has said, actually, this is not in any way a reasonable way to operate. We're going to pull out and try a different strategy.
And I think even especially as health workers, our faith in these humanitarian systems is part of our own demobilization, right? The fact that it took health workers so long to get politically organized or to join some of the flotillas and some of the convoys is part of this kind of residual or maybe still very strong like faith in these systems that are not designed to deliver liberation, but kind of to pacify.
And racism is at the heart of that, because the thing that happened is instead of listening to Palestinians to explain what the meaning of the words that the Zionist leaders were saying and what the actions they were taking were going to result in, the trust was put in the Israeli officials themselves saying, oh, actually, that's not quite what we mean. Even after, right? It's racism. It's not us not being able to narrate our own experience.
Yeah. Hannah, I want to come to you. I think something that lots of us are grappling with and need to grappling with is the reality that many of us live and are based in the imperial core, right? Which is the driver of not only this genocide but also 200 years of genocides of indigenous peoples in the pursuit of capitalist accumulation, and sitting from the position of the imperial core where the arms are made, where the London financial centres provide the insurance and the financing for all of these systems. What does that mean for us as workers, as community organisers in that context?
Yeah, thank you. I think it all needs to be tied together, and we need people to understand the country we're living in, because I think a lot of people get away with thinking there are possibly good things. I just wanted to start with 3 quotes to illustrate this. Maybe the first one is by the revolutionary Palestinian Ghassan Kanafani, imperialism has laid its body over the world, the head in Eastern Asia, the heart in the Middle East. Its arteries reach Africa and Latin America. Wherever you strike it, you damage it, and you serve the world revolution. And I think that's a very important concept of, you know, our struggle to understand where we are in comparison to the rest of the world. I wanted to quote Alison Pollock, who's a public health doctor in Britain, who said the Labour Party, which created the NHS, has become dedicated to its destruction. Because I think it's really important for us to understand as health workers what context we're working in, and the Labour Party, which I'll come back to a bit. And Frantz Fanon, who you've already mentioned, but the political philosopher and the psychiatrist from Martinique, who said each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And our generation, whether, you know, it doesn't matter what age we are, but our generation, you know, that's all of us now. Our mission is Palestine. And we must give unconditional support to the liberation movements, and recognize that our freedom in general in Britain, you know, is cannot be divorced and cannot be won without the freedom of the Palestinians. And when we look at the world we live in, the sort of unprecedented wealth and the technological advances that we've seen, even over some of our short lifetimes, you know, but the unprecedented poverty and oppression and the contradictions that we're living in. And we have to understand this, and humanitarianism will not solve those contradictions. You know, there are tens of millions of people dying of hunger, but there are mountains of surplus food. There are over 1/3 of the world with no safe water, but parts of Africa are using 7,000 gallons per acre per day to grow flowers for export. You know, these figures are so shocking, but we have to understand how this world is created. $2.7 trillion are spent on arms every year, while a quarter of that, probably even less, you know, would ensure food, shelter, health, education for everyone in the world. But obviously that's not how it works. And Israel, as has been said, has dropped over 100,000 tons of explosives on Gaza in 2 years. It's so shocking. That is over 6 times Hiroshima. And British manufacturers, as people have said, you know, only the British ones have received contracts to produce F-35 components worth over $6.7 billion in the last 2 years. And this is the consequence of imperialism, you know, an economic system that means those in the rich core, the imperial core, will dominate by exploiting and super exploiting the rest of the world. And Britain's history is stealing, looting, pillaging, oppressing, occupying. And when things happen here, I think we also need to understand that that's not necessarily humanitarian. So the creation of the welfare state and the NHS in the post-war period was because there was a post-war boom. It was economically possible. There were people coming back from the war. The working class demanded better. They'd seen the Soviet Union, etc., etc. And healthcare became a right in 1948 in Britain, but now it's becoming a commodity again. And the NHS is being dismantled and privatized, and that privatization is actually very expensive. But capitalism doesn't care about that. But it's, you know, so it's the loss of services, the loss of universality in health here, and the loss of equality that, you know, that we also have to think about. The austerity in Britain means putting all of the difficulties onto the most disadvantaged. And so just to say a little bit about what's happening for people in the imperial heartland, in the belly of the beast. I mean, the 2-child benefit cap, where 100 children every day are falling into poverty, and I think 1.6 million children and families affected. The disability living allowance cuts have savagely affected the life of people with disabilities in this country. London boroughs spend I'm only laughing because it's such an incredible figure I'm about to say. London boroughs spend £4.5 million every single day on the bill for temporary accommodation in London. You know, so the sort of market madness and the chaos of this system, you know, homelessness is rising. People live with damp and mold, overcrowding. We know the health impact of that on adults, on children. And then private equity firms and hedge funds and banks, you know, investing millions in housing because it generates the best returns, apart from the arms industry, I presume. But it's an investment, it's a commodity, you know, it's about land and the cost of land, you know, but it's not to house people. And I think we have to talk about racism that's been talked about before, but the domestic expression of this parasitic relationship that Britain has with the rest of the world. And since 1945, Britain has seen 19 major immigration acts, and they're all racist. They're all about fulfilling the needs for Britain, whether they need labour or they don't need labour. They'll let people in or they won't let people in. And our hospitals that we work in are filled with migrants working for tendered out companies with poor working conditions, often haven't got holiday pay or sick pay, for companies who are making millions, and these people aren't NHS employees. So I think this is all part of understanding, where we are and what we're facing. And it was Britain that enabled the setting up of the racist settler state of Israel. And we, the Zionist entity, and we have to work that out and realize that. And it continues to arm fund. And it is an outpost of imperialism. And the Labour Party is a racist, genocidal, imperialist party. And people need to understand that as well. It's not an alternative. It's not better. And people have seen over the last 2 years what the truth of it is, but it isn't actually new, but it's even more severe. And so Palestine is the issue. It's the issue for the ruling class, for the working class. It's the issue for the split in the newly formed Your Party. It's the issue for those who are disgusted by the Labour Party and will never vote for it again. And so I think we need to look at humanitarianism in the context of all of these things and understand, what Britain stands for, which is, an appalling sight when we see what's happened to the genocide. And yes, something has to be other than just voting, because that's what people would like, isn't it? We could vote for something better. But this is a system that needs far more than voting it out. Systemic change, and humanitarianism isn't about systemic change. It's about patching over and falsifying in a way what is possible to make things better.
Exactly. And I think that those connections that you really outlined, I think, for me, when I kind of first became radicalized, it feels overwhelming, but actually it guides you towards effective and strategic action in a way that kind of endlessly kind of chipping at a humanitarian approach, you will eventually feel its futility. And I think we can see how in the UK the incredibly intense crackdown on some of the most effective forms of protest and direct action is an indication that we do have the power to disrupt these economic systems. And I think before we kind of go on to some of the really amazing kind of historical and current political struggles, I wanted to ask if anyone else wanted to come in on kind of what Hannah said about, our mission is Palestine. Palestine is this issue that exposes and connects so many of the core issues at the core of colonial capitalism, from surveillance to the arms industry to environmentalism. And I wanted to see if anyone else wanted to come in on kind of elaborating on that.
So for me, one of the interesting approaches that Ali Qadri, who's a political economist, has been looking at is that late capitalism now accumulates waste and not value. And it accumulates both human waste and environmental waste with the aim of reducing the lifespans of surplus populations. With the genocide and the arms industry being the perfect example of the accumulation of waste, because you're producing a commodity that is usable only once. That is the perfect siphoning mechanism for public resources from the welfare of the laborers that make these bombs to the universities that produce the technology that makes these bombs. And then all of that money is then siphoned into the private sector and to produce a product that achieves two things. It helps get rid of surplus populations in the global south and is only usable once. And therefore, you then produce the next one, and you then produce the next one. So it enables you to create, by accumulating human waste, to create value that continuously renews itself. And he sets out that actually also environmental waste, environmental degradation, is a critical component of the same economic process. What Hannah is describing, in my opinion, is the social genocide that happens in the core of the imperial power, which is the decrease in lifespans of surplus economic populations. The aim of austerity measures, the aim of labor's disability law is to reduce the lifespan of these individuals so that they do not live as long as the other populations that have access to the technological advancement that medicine is affording. And so we have situations in Glasgow where if you cross the street, lifespan drops by 10 years in between one neighborhood and the other. And this is not a side effect of an economic process, but the aim of an economic process. That once populations are deemed surplus, they need to be rid of. And they are gotten rid of either, as in the case of Gaza, by a process that generates wealth through their killing. So their killing becomes the mining exercise. Or in the West, where their lives are just shortened by the lack of housing, the lack of healthcare, increasing environmental degradation. All of this acts to shorten people's lives. If you say that there are, in a country of, let's say, 10 million, there are 2 million who have 10 years, live 10 years shorter, then that's effectively, if the rest of the population is living to say 100 years, that's 10% of the 2 million are being killed at any one point. And therefore, the discrepancy, the intentional discrepancy between the increasing lifespan afforded by technological advancement and the decreasing lifespan as a result of intentional economic policies is part of the same genocidal machinery.
I mean, what else to say other than that? I think just to tie together what Hannah and Hassan have both just said and bring it back to humanitarianism. I mean, humanitarianism was conceived of this tool of managing the surplus. There's this notion of humanitarian government, which, as Hassan mentioned at the very beginning there, we're now seeing the end even of this kind of liberal or illiberal humanitarianism, because no longer do these states see a need to even manage the surplus. They are quite happy to sort of just brazenly acknowledge that people are surplus and the planet is surplus, and to do as they will.
The issue at hand is, or at the heart of what we're talking about, is power. If you believe that power is used to destroy people's lives in the global south and to reduce them in the global north, then any mechanism, including humanitarianism, that does not address the discrepancy in power, does not oppose the exercise of power, is complicit. There's no vacuum. There's no power vacuum that exists anywhere. There's no neutrality. That you either are with the power that is taking people's lives, taking their health, producing that world in which they do not live a full life, or you are part of it and you're just trying to prolong it. And we saw humanitarianism has enabled Israel to make the genocide last for 2 years. It was critical. Had everybody walked out of Gaza by October, November 2023, the genocide would have been much shorter. I cannot believe that any NGO that has 2 operating rooms in a field hospital on nights where there were on average between 300 and 500 wounded coming in really believed that it changed the outcome for Palestinians anyway.
And I wonder, no, you go, James.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Rhiannon, I'm coming back to the question that you asked me that I clumsily answered earlier. You know, what is the responsibility of someone who is somehow able to negotiate access? Well, it's a little bit like this over this sort of sense of self-importance among folks who are going bearing witness and then coming out and not really doing an awful lot with that. And there are far more people who have gone to Gaza and who have come out who have not said anything, who have remained silent, in many cases hoping to preserve their ability to return. And one has to ask, do you feel that you have golden healing hands? That there is something so precious about your return when there are so many other healthcare workers who should also see that obligation to go, to bear witness, to come out, to speak out. And that has just completely collapsed. There was, again, much like Gassan is mentioning, this sort of belief that a single operating theatre or a handful of people who are being allowed in, who are being permitted to enter, is somehow going to change the course of things.
Well, the same government that's paid for these 2 operating rooms is the government that's paid for the missiles producing 300 and 500.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And so you cannot believe that somehow that government has multiple personalities. It has a single personality with a single aim, both being served by the different arms of the exercise of power.
And I think there's a point I want to bring in here, I think that's come through in the questions, and I think really links to this, how we understand the purposes and the purpose of the system, which I think there's a really great handbook called I'm going to forget the name, but a Just Transition Handbook by Movement Generation. And they outline how kind of an extractive capitalist economy works, and they outline how the purpose of an economy is what it does, not what it says it does. And the current imperialist economy does disposability of life. That's what it does, and it does that in the name of and for the purpose of accumulating wealth and power. What it says that it does is kind of irrelevant. And economy is what it does. But actually, that was a second point to the question that's come through. And I think one of the other things that humanitarianism does is it single issues what are interconnected liberation struggles, because it's very easy to fundraise for a single issue. You know, even in environmentalism, it's much easier for an environmental group to say, save the polar bears rather than destroy the pipelines of this oil company. And that's very deliberate because it's more palatable, it's easier to fundraise for, it's easier to build an industry around,
and it doesn't challenge power.
Exactly. Yeah, and so one of the questions has been about sometimes I'm being asked when I'm talking about Palestinian liberation, why I'm not doing X for people in this country, or why I'm not also organizing around Congo, or the person saying, how do we counter whataboutism? And I think it's through this engaged kind of understanding of colonial capitalism that recognizes that these are not separate struggles, and the people who are asking you that see these as individual humanitarian crises. And actually, what we need to remember is that, one of Israel's biggest economic exports is diamonds, and it has no diamond mines. And one of the largest diamond mines in Congo is owned by an Israeli mine. So these struggles are never separate, and it's only through understanding the powers that prop up colonial capitalism that you can kind of then see that and counter some of that kind of siloization.
It's about understanding that the highest form of political solidarity that all movements need to strive towards is a solidarity based on the belief in the unity of the struggle. And unless you believe in the unity of the struggle, then you accept a power differential. And that power differential is an expression, saviorism is an expression of power differential. But believing in the unity of the struggle means that you believe that it is your struggle in Gaza that you need to go and fight, and your struggle in the Congo that you need to go and fight, and your struggle in Sudan that you need to go and fight, so that your life in Britain is a better life. Because the same people who are destroying lives there are destroying lives here by different mechanisms and at different speeds, but nonetheless that's what they're doing.
I think also the humanitarianism, like the field hospitals and everything, has actually been quite hit. I don't know the answer to this is a question really, but so there is all this humanitarianism going on that makes everyone's supposed to feel better that we can do something, or someone's doing something, or we can send money to, or whatever. But actually, I don't think in all the reports that everyone's reading all the time, people are really aware of these field hospitals, for instance, hospitals. And I think, maybe that's also, well, I don't know, there's a contradiction as well, isn't there? The sort of drive to do these things and in the end to take over, like Hassan's saying, that actually now people want to buy up what's left, which is absolutely outrageous. But at the same time, having not really trumpeted the fact that they're doing it, so people may even know that they're doing the wrong thing, and they don't want it publicized, because actually the pictures that everyone is seeing is of destruction. And a fantastic thing that I read somewhere, that Palestinians are being showcased by their wounds and their bodies, but their political voices are unheard. And that is also, perhaps nobody wants to know about the field hospitals because they want to show you the destroyed hospital. I don't know.
I think there's some very beautiful questions coming about what do kind of practices of solidarity medicine or liberation medicine look like currently and have looked like. And Layth, I know that this is your kind of area of research and expertise, and I was wondering if you could share some of the really amazing vast knowledge you have about politicized health work in the context of the Palestinian struggle, and what we can learn from that. And yeah, it'd be great to hear.
So I'll take maybe a bit of a historical kind of turn here, and this is going back to the era of popular struggles, not just in Palestine, but but around the world. And this is, from the 1970s onwards, and this is kind of in the particularly in the context of Palestine after the total occupation of the entirety of Palestine. So after the West Bank and Gaza Strip were also then occupied, as well as bits of Syria and Egypt. And this kind of turn from the state-led anti-colonial struggle to kind of popular movement fueled anti-colonial struggle, you had this fight for sovereignty that we've already kind of touched upon a couple of times. This fight for sovereignty, the political sovereignty, then manifesting with struggles across different sectors. So health was seen as no different, and you see at that time in the 70s and then the 80s, all Palestinian political leaders speaking very clearly and very consistently that the revolution is not just the weapon, it's not just the resistance to the presence of occupiers on our land, but it's also and they always list, the scalpel of the surgeon and the pen of the writer. And so it's the cultural production, it's the education, it's the agriculture, right? It's also, particularly in these predominantly agricultural societies, this is a really kind of key thing. And you see a lot of people coming from all over the world, from Europe, from and in particular, but also Palestinians and Global South comrades exchanging personnel, exchanging ideas, volunteering to provide healthcare services. Whether it's the first kind of major organization to do this was the Palestine Red Crescent Society, and it was kind of part of this this government in exile that the PLO was trying to found, and this idea of having sovereignty over our self-determination, even if even before we are able to return. But then you also had a similar model of trying to exercise this sovereignty through the provision of healthcare services, building both legitimacy for the struggle, but also providing fuel to people by making them healthier so that they can engage in the struggle, being a really key component of the struggle of the Palestinian movements within Palestinian territories. So organizations that are today NGOs in the very neoliberal sense actually started out as popular movements, the medical relief committees and the health work committees, providing healthcare services as this place, as these centers for struggle, as part of an entire ecosystem of struggle. And that was aborted by neoliberalism, both the work itself and the solidarity. So, you had the Palestinian Red Crescent Society setting up hospitals, field hospitals, as well as clinics, and tapping into, even fitting into health systems in Yemen, in Uganda, in Libya, as a way of providing solidarity. And today when we think of health missions, we think of Cuba as the most prominent country that does this, but this was a very common practice across the world in the 70s and 80s, and it is really neoliberalism that then aborted that. And so when you fast forward to now,
on the funding agencies of the humanitarian sector, I mean, the funding agencies of the humanitarian sector after Oslo came in with the mission of dismantling
Yes.
these grassroots health organizations and creating the discourse of private health systems.
Yep.
And they played a critical role in the same role in Latin America
Yep.
with grassroots organizations and political movements.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they took away not just clinical workers from hospitals and turned them into NGO compradorial classes, but they also destroyed the relationship between the masses and these health organizations.
Absolutely.
And what we're witnessing now, and it's a really serious and worrying thing. And again, the problem with talking about it is that it uses the dire conditions that the genocide has created in people's lives, where you cannot possibly blame people engaging in it, Palestinians engaging in it. But we see dozens of young Palestinian doctors being taken out of Gaza at the moment and enrolled into non-clinical programs in British universities, in European universities, as a act of humanitarianism. So not only are you taking them out of Palestine, but you're also taking them out of clinical work and giving them, to paraphrase the book, bullshit jobs, bullshit degrees. And the same that's happening, it appears that Western powers have identified the Palestinian health system as a critical part of what prevented the total erasure of Palestinians. And therefore, it will be the center, again, as it was during the genocide, the center of dismantlement in what we can call the Native American reservations phase of the Gaza genocide, which is what the Trump plan is.
Yep.
And the problem is that people having gone through what they've gone through, you can't blame them for just wanting to take a breather and grasp any straw that is thrown to them. But you have to be suspicious of these universities that, one, use this to launder their political positions during the war. Two, economically, none of them is offering these scholarships from its own funds, but are asking other funding organizations to take over. And then they're taking out these young clinicians and giving them non-clinical roles.
And specifically on that, and I think it's important to think about why the healthcare system itself was this target for emptying it out. And I think looking at the 15 years prior to the genocide is important, where I think people will be shocked to know, but it's important to talk about this, that prior to the genocide, the healthcare system in Gaza had actually become this place for the exercise of Palestinian sovereignty more than any other Palestinian territory, right? So the autonomy that the Gazan health workers had over their own health systems, and therefore, how funds were being distributed and how people were being trained, was to a much better degree in Gaza than it was, for example, in the West Bank, and obviously way more than Palestinians in 48 have, because they are co-opted completely into the Israeli health system. and a lot more than the disenfranchised Palestinian populations in exile. And so I think that it was this bastion for the exercise of sovereignty in a way that didn't exist for us in other places. And I really think that's that is one of the main reasons why it's being targeted in this way, to be emptied out and to be hollowed out.
If you want to think about scorched earth policy, when it started out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s during the wars in Vietnam and Korea and Laos and Cambodia, it was the rural areas that were being targeted because they were the centers of population and the centers of sovereignty, of people sovereignty, because they provided mechanisms by which people still independent of global capital were able to exist. Fast forward to the 21st century, the majority of the third world's population now lives in places that look like us. They live in favelas, they live in shanty towns, they live in bloated cities like Nairobi or Manila or Mexico City. And therefore, what scorched earth looks like now involves not Agent Orange to defoliate trees, but the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of sewage pipes, the bombing of water and sewage treatment plants. That is the other reason why health is central to what is being planned, what happened in Gaza over the last 2 years, the centrality of the destruction of the health system to the genocide, and what is being planned in the reservation phase of the genocide, which is what we're living now and what the Trump plan envisage. It's critical to destroy the health system in the scorched earth policy, and it will happen in everywhere else. We saw it a few weeks later after the ceasefire in Fasher in Darfur in Sudan, where the first thing that was destroyed was the hospitals when Fasher city fell. And so that centrality of destroying health systems is critical to the modern view of scorched earth.
And James, I don't know if you want to come in here. I think one of the things that Layth highlighted that's really important is that many of these kind of radical experiments in community health and solidarity-based medicine then went on to become very neoliberalized NGOs. And so I was wondering, from your kind of research and academia, what kind of historical lessons we can draw from the NGOization of what were kind of many radical social movements.
I mean, this is a trajectory that we've been on for a very long time. I think Layth articulates really clearly how that has played out in Palestine. It's so well documented that, books have been written about processes of NGOization whereby you have capture of radical political visions and the kind of bureaucratization, regularization, sort of institutionalization of sort of social and political movements in different contexts. And now we have, of course, now we look to, or at least until this moment, for the most part, we've looked to these large NGOs as the sort of protectors of certain values and principles and so on. We have bought this idea, or perhaps I should say many in the West and the global North have bought this idea of a particular benevolence that's kind of caught up within these institutions. At the same time, and I'm glad that we mentioned universities and kind of academic spaces of academic production as well, because there's also been this kind of capture within the academy, increasingly kind of neoliberal. UK higher education isn't disguising itself any longer. These are just neoliberal entities that have, as Ghassan has said, offered a couple of scholarships on the back of saying, at best, saying and doing nothing during the genocide, but in many cases actually engaging in active complicity through
making a killing. I mean, we have to kind of remind people that what having shares in BAE systems, which is which is what the case is in the majority of British universities, means is that all of the profit that was generated during the genocide has gone into these universities in the tens of millions. I mean, the one case that the Guardian wrote about, MBDA, the company that makes the wings from one of the missiles that was used in Gaza, that company made 350 million just on its own. It's a small subsidiary of BAE Systems. So BAE Systems got the 350 million. The British universities got their share as shareholders from the dividends of that. And this is just a single company making a single part of a weapons system. So you can imagine the hundreds of other weapon systems that are being used and how much money has been made. You know, Gaza, as Francesca Albanese showed, made a lot of corporations extremely wealthy in the killing. The process of killing Palestinians is a process of mining Palestinian bodies the same way as in Congo, mining the land produces wealth. In Palestine, mining Palestinian bodies produced wealth.
Hannah, I want to come to you now for something that we talked about before, which I think was a really important reflection when we ask ourselves this question of, as health workers, you know, and organizing or practicing clinically in attempting to be a liberatory or radical way. You talked about some of the risk of kind of siloing, and I wonder if you could kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Could I say a little bit about Cuba first?
Yeah, of course, please.
I just wanted to say a little bit about Cuba because you mentioned Cuba, and you know, I think it is really important as internationalists that we recognise, you know, countries that are standing with Palestine and what they stand for. And I mean, Cuba since 1959, after it ousted a US-backed dictator, has been trying to create socialism, trying to build that process. It's a long way. It's very difficult. They're under an illegal blockade by the US. But they voted against partition of Palestine in 1947. Che Guevara was in Gaza in 1959, and in 1973 they formally broke relations with the Zionist entity. And I think that is important. And Fidel Castro said, "We send doctors, not bombs," and they've prioritized medical internationalism over military aggression. And their medical internationalism is not humanitarianism. And they have more doctors abroad than the whole of the World Health Organization. They've, since 1960, sent more than 40,000 healthcare workers in over 80 countries to be part and parcel of issues. You know, they offered doctors and healthcare workers to the US after Hurricane Katrina, and they were turned down. Such is, you know, the relationship between imperialism and, you know, they would prefer not to have people come to help if it involves, you know, recognizing what Cuba's achieved. And Operation Miracle with Venezuela, Latin America, and the Caribbean has restored sight to millions of people by simply removing their cataracts. You know, and this is something that's very important. The Latin American School of Medicine, where there are Palestinians who've spoken out very beautifully, but, you know, is training doctors for free from countries where people could never afford to go to medical school. And that once they are trained, they go back to their countries to work as doctors. So I think that stands in sharp contrast to humanitarianism. And you know, Cuba is a country where the president marches at the head of the demonstrations, you know, against the genocide, and that's so rare. So I just wanted to add that in. But I think we must accept everything that everyone is doing for Palestine into a movement that then takes on the politicization of that movement, I suppose. You know, we need to continuously talk about the right of nations to self-determination, our unconditional support for liberation movements, and we must recognize that the enemy of the Palestinians is the Zionist entity, but that our enemy is the British state. And I think our British state that backs Zionism, and I think that's how we build a movement that takes that on. You know, we must oppose the Labour Party, which is now in government, it's not in opposition. It's not going to do anything better. It's doing the worst thing it could do, the genocidal, imperialist, racist Labour Party, true to its history. And we must demand complete sanctions against the Zionist entity, political, diplomatic, military, no more support. And we must stand with everyone who's facing the consequences of standing with Palestine. So we must defend the right to defend Palestine. We must defend, whether it's the students, like people at LSE, UCLH, SOAS, the SOAS 2, all in London, but all around the country, the doctors, nurses, healthcare workers who are facing, the GMC, being reported by UK Lawyers for Israel, etc., all those organisations that are singling out people who are merely saying this is not right. This is, we must, that silence is complicity, and activists such as the Filton 24 and all of those people who have actually taken direct action. So I think all of those things are part and part of a movement, and obviously we absolutely give our support and solidarity to those who've gone from Britain to Gaza to take part in any work that involves saving lives, while recognizing everything that's been said about the limits of that. But solidarity with Palestine for those of us in Britain is building a movement against capitalism, against imperialism, against racism. And I think what you were referring to is this whole discussion about healthcare workers. So I think we must be in the struggle. We can't be exclusively working amongst healthcare workers, just as we can't be exclusively saying that Palestine is the only issue, because the whole thing is interconnected, and the struggle for our liberation is the struggle for the liberation of the Palestinians, and the end of the genocide in Gaza, and the end of the occupation of Palestine, and recognizing what imperialism does abroad, what happens here, that interconnectedness means, whether we're talking about children's health, housing, cuts and austerity, the disparity in wealth in this country, the people who are benefiting from it all, that we stand with Palestine, and we stand for all of our liberation by connecting those issues.
Absolutely. So kind of jumping back into the discussion that we were having, I wanted to reflect a bit on what we mean by organizing, kind of what Hannah said about, building a movement that actually has the power to confront the British state and to confront capitalism and imperialism. And I think it's really important in this context to think about the difference between mobilizing and organizing. So mobilizing is, say, like hundreds of thousands of people on the street. That's good in many ways, and like is important for many reasons. That doesn't guarantee that you have the power to enact your demands. So mobilizing, okay, all of these people are unhappy about this and they're demanding X, Y, and Z. An organized movement is unhappy about something and demanding X, Y, and Z, and has the power to make that a problem for whoever they are demanding it from. And I think that's where, not only as health workers, but as kind of leftists across the West, we have been extremely demobilized over the last couple of decades, from, again, partly through this humanitarian infrastructure of funneling kind of energy and radical energy into NGOs and to humanitarianism, with the idea that, if we reform the system, then we'll get what we want, rather than building our power to challenge the system ourselves. And I wanted to speak a bit about one of the kind of organizing campaigns that Health Workers for a Free Palestine is working on, which is the campaign to get Palantir out of the NHS, and why it's not only kind of an outcry over something that is objectively wrong and objectively bad, but also a key site of building power. And that's kind of the aim of organizing. And so with the example of Palantir, an AI weapons and military company who provides AI warfare technology that's used in Gaza, but then is also used to run ICE's mass deportation program in the US, them gaining access to the UK's health data and managing that health data is not only, of course, an ethical horror, it's also a strategic and further incursion of the state into our healthcare and of the extractivist logic into our healthcare. So, within the healthcare system, first you exploit labor and you exploit pharmaceuticals, and then now we're onto the stage of exploiting data, which is not just only in healthcare, but across various aspects of the economy. So it's a key incursion of capitalism further into our health system, with the commodification and the profiteering and the AI strategic use of data from health systems. It's also an expansion of the ability to surveil populations through our health system. We see this through, the existing work of Patients Not Passports that's exposed how the Home Office operates through the NHS. And you see companies like Palantir offering increasingly kind of what's termed predictive policing technologies to UK police, to the US police, that were tested and developed by providing those services to the Zionist entity. And so this choice of target is not only because it's an ethical horror, but because this sight of the convalescence between Palestine, the privatization of the health system, AI, data rights, and surveillance is a key area of power. But what this requires is not only for us to go on marches and write petitions, it requires us to build our kind of skills as health workers to be able to sustain a problem. So not only say we don't want this, but to make it a problem for it to be implemented. So not only say this is wrong, but to say this is wrong and we are going to obstruct you from implementing it. And we are going to build our power such that we can obstruct that implementation. And that requires us in many ways to move beyond, one of the questions has spoken to the passivity that not only as health workers, but I think as people, especially in the West, we are really trained into, of thinking that somebody else is going to come and do this organizing and, we'll just wait for the right revolutionary leader to come and tell us what to do. And actually this work requires time, it requires dedication, it requires an ability to sit with conflict and to work through group issues in order to be able to sustain over a prolonged period of time, to build up and sustain your own power, to actually create a problem for the imperialist state rather than kind of voice your discontent with the imperialist state. And so I wanted to kind of open up that question, I guess, and I think to the panelists' reflections on how can we be looking to build our own power as in through alternative channels to humanitarianism. And so I know that Layth, you've previously spoken to really amazing examples of kind of politicized community health work that are going on now. Hassan, the talk that you gave in Oslo about the principles of liberation medicine was very kind of fundamental to the way that I think many of us think about this. And so I wanted to open it up, and I think that's what a lot of the questions are speaking to, right? Is how do we then, if we are kind of denouncing the mechanisms that currently exist, what does it look like to build our own power outside of those systems? So anyone can jump in.
I can maybe start with just kind of a bit of a explanation based on my understanding, having witnessed how this is being built in the few pockets where I think it's being built effectively within kind of my communities in Palestine. I think one of the really key things in the kind of hegemonic systems that we are living under at the moment is thinking about economic systems, right? And so we talk about divestment a lot, and that's obviously very important. But I think there's less talk maybe and less attention, maybe because it's less glamorous, but also less obvious and more difficult around how to build alternative systems. And so for me, the most inspiring work that's going on, not just in Palestine, but in lots of other places, is where people have been able to somewhat divest, and I don't think anyone is able to fully divest, or not that I've seen, but somewhat divest from the economic system that's being imposed to one that there is more popular control over, there is more community ownership over. And so you see places where there is almost fugitive farming that's happening against all odds in a lot of places in very vulnerable areas that are being targeted by settlers that are very close to or in areas that are being confiscated or threatened with confiscation. And that then builds at least a little bit of economic maneuvering room for the communities that engage with that in order to reduce their dependence on the neoliberal systems that co-opt them and demobilize them. And then that actually opens up a conversation for things around, cultural production, political production, and all of these different things. It's not just, farming, but also sometimes it's furniture repair or, carpentry, all of these kind of small scale things sometimes end up being successful at growing and then sustaining small community-based work.
Mm.
And one of the most impressive examples that I know of is one where it's expanded so much that this ecosystem of cooperatives, for example, is able to sustain scholarships for university students that then volunteer within the various cooperatives, and that obviously then generates more income, and people are eating healthier because they're growing their own vegetables and they've got a health supermarket. And all of these things are fitting into an ecosystem. It's a small ecosystem, but it's a really good example of that. And I know there are examples going on in Britain and elsewhere, but that's something that I draw inspiration from at a time when the demobilization is so pervasive and organizing within our workspaces becomes incredibly difficult, especially in professionalized spaces where, because doctors have been fooled into this idea of wanting to be part of the elite rather than thinking of themselves as part of the broader struggle. I think that's one of the challenges that I faced when I was working in the UK is like these colleagues kind of around me up wanting to be part of the elite. They liked being part of the elite, even though they had a government that was this was at a time when the junior doctor contracts were coming in, and people were being they had income stolen from them by the government. They were being oppressed by the government, but they still didn't want to see themselves as workers. They wanted to be they saw as what they saw was better than that.
Yeah, and I think super quickly before going to other panelists, I think when we think about examples of kind of cooperatives and autonomous economies, it's easy to feel, well, that's small, and like how do we? But I think these are part of broader liberation struggles, and they are linked to that wider liberation struggle, and I think. I think the kind of capitalist imperialist powers, they stress about small, well, quote, small things. And I think there's two examples that give me a lot of energy. One is the Socialist Patients Collective, which was a German kind of anti-psychiatry collective where psychiatrists and psychologists were experimenting with anti-capitalist and radical forms of mental health care with patients in a non-hierarchical kind of collective and radical experiment in like a small, it's written really beautifully about in the book Health Communism in like a small town in Germany. They were just doing their clinic, and they were all labeled as terrorists and driven from the country because that was apparently like such a threat to the capitalist system for these kind of psychiatrists to be exploring how capitalism might have created the mental distress that their patients were facing. And to give a more recent example, we have been organizing in various kind of locations around the country around the Palantir contract, and Palantir officially replied to a article in the Cambridge Varsity, like the student newspaper in Cambridge, about their technology, with an official response to the claims made in the Cambridge, I think maybe it wasn't the Varsity, but this this tiny newspaper locally. And I think that shows that like these small experiments in radicality and these organizing structures, they clearly matter because the kind of powers are incredibly stressed by them. And yeah, I wanted to hand over to you two for your thoughts on that, and then Hannah as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have so much to say on this. There's a quote that comes to mind that I made a note of a couple of weeks back. To oppose something is to maintain it. You must go somewhere else. You must have another goal. Um, Forgive me, I can't remember. I can't attribute that to the right person, but I think this is where at some point some of the critique of humanitarianism I think is super important. But we see some of the current critiques are in many ways revisiting critiques that have existed for 20 or 30 years. And that is entirely to be expected because nothing has changed. But the more interesting and important and urgent question is indeed engaging with what else? What else are we meant to be kind of co-creating? And you use the word imagining. To draw from the abolitionist traditions, the work of Lola Olufemi, whose writing I really enjoy, experiments in imagining otherwise. These are questions around existing through really awful systems, the terrible present, and also imagining and enacting beyond. And I think that there is certainly in my lifetime, this is the most engaged and vibrant that certainly the Palestine solidarity movement has ever been. There does seem to be a willingness and a kind of a thirst and a hunger for a different kind of political education. And for me, that is the foundation that in many spaces is still lacking. We need to be able to confidently name the problem, the problem that runs through everything and that connects everything, to come back to some of the quotes that you gave at the very beginning, Hannah. And from there, I think we can mobilize. If we have a shared politics, a shared understanding and appreciation of who and what the enemy is, then we can start building. And that work is slowly happening, despite the threats that have been leveled against us in our workplaces, by these large multinational corporations, in relatively obscure local newspapers and so on, that there is a sort of a resistance that is starting to form, I think.
I think, Hannah, can we go to you? And then I think we probably need to wrap up. So I'll end on you, Hassan, if that's okay.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things as health workers we need to do is to unite as health workers. So the thing you said about Palantir is really important because of everything that it brings together. You know, what's happening in Britain, what's happening to our data, what's happening for migrants in the US, what's happening, you know, with the Home Office, what's happening with surveillance. You know, something like that is so important. We need to get together with that. We need to work out why there's such pay disparity in the health service. You know, we need to work out who's, you know, yeah, who has rights, who doesn't have rights. I think there's sort of the separation of health workers into their different bits, you know, makes it much harder to bring them together. But I also think that Palestine is always the issue, because that is our issue, and it is relevant, you know, that the hospitals are destroyed, that the health workers are slaughtered and targeted. That's relevant when we're talking about healthcare in Britain, you know, and I think if we can just educate, you know, all the time, in as broad as we can, like you say. So we are marching, we are in our numbers on the streets, but we're also building a movement that challenges, you know, the core of British imperialism and the Labour government. And if people give up on Labour, something else will take its place. We have to challenge that as well, because we have to challenge the capitalist system, because it will not provide for people, it will not solve poverty, you know, it will not solve land grab, it will definitely not liberate the Palestinians. And so I suppose it's about, yes, education. I do work in a housing campaign in East London, and we say educate, agitate, organise. You know, and I think, yeah,
Nice. Thank you
we
very
need to
much.
do that.
And yeah, I'll hand over to you.
I think one of the things that has happened in the genocide for people is that Gaza has lit up the whole network grid of power. And so we saw it all being lit up, from the largest institutions to health institutions, to the smallest university, to what was referred to mistakenly as civil society. We realize that all of these institutions are institutions of power, of the state, and answer to the state. That means that it is easier to explain to people the interconnection between their own daily oppression and what is happening in Palestine. And I think that is critical to build on. What is also very critical to build on is this idea that at the end of the day, colonial projects are an economic endeavor based on cost and benefit, and continuing to destabilize the core of the imperium in defending Palestine, as we saw over the last 2 years, as we saw with the general strike in Italy, is a critical weapon that we use to end the genocide, both in its rapid phase and in its quiet phase now. And therefore, continuing to be on the street, continuing to agitate and mobilize and have people come out in the same numbers is critical for 2 reasons. You need to break the idea that humanitarianism is based on, which is that pity is what motivates people and not solidarity. And that the Palestinians, in order to get your support, need to be continuously bleeding on the screen daily so that you can come out. And if you can get people to break that cycle, then you're able to then build a movement.
I think that's a really perfect and powerful note to end on. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone who is joining in now. Thanks to everyone who's watching the recording, and of course, thank you so much to the really wonderful panelists.
Thank you, Rhiannon.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
Thanks.
Except for James.